What do you do when the enemy is on your tail, your plane can't outturn him, and the training manual says the only escape will kill you? You're forced into an impossible choice: obey doctrine and die, or break the rules and try something that might. In 1942, over the vast Pacific, American pilots faced that choice every day. The sky belonged to one machine, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, so light and nimble it could climb like a rocket and turn on a dime. In a classic horizontal dogfight, the odds were simple: you didn't win. So what would you risk to live? The year is 1942. The skies of the Pacific belong to one plane, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. To American pilots, it's a phantom, impossibly agile, feather-light, able to climb like a rocket and flip inside the turn of any Allied fighter. Sight a zero, and your training turns to ash. It outclimbs you, outturns you, and seems to appear where you least expect it. Entire squadrons learned to watch the sky for that silhouette, because once a zero had you in its sights, the odds felt mathematical and merciless. For a generation of young flyers, the Zero wasn't just an enemy, it was the definition of danger. Engaging a Zero in a classic horizontal dogfight was almost literally a death sentence. Turn with it, and you lost fast. The Zero's design let it outroll, outclimb, and outturn almost every Allied fighter in the Pacific, so a tight, sweeping dogfight wasn't a test of skill so much as a math problem with one predictable answer. American pilots could watch a tailing Zero slip into their blind spot and know there was very little they could do to reverse it. That ugly truth forced a reckoning. If you couldn't match the Zero in a turn, you had to find a different way to survive. They weren't rookies thrown into the sky. These were battle-hardened pilots who had spent years fighting over China and had honed instincts no classroom could teach. Calm under fire. Precise with throttle and stick. They read the air the way a boxer reads a jab, anticipating, baiting, punishing. Against them came young American pilots fresh from training fields and simulators, bright-eyed but raw, taught doctrine on paper, not in blood. That gap in experience turned every encounter into a lesson, and usually a painful one, because the Zero wasn't just a better plane on paper. In the hands of those veterans, it was lethal. They don't stumble into a trap by accident. Japanese pilots learned to choreograph it. With patient circling, subtle feints, and pressure at the exact moment a Yank pilot's instincts kick in, they lure their foe into a horizontal turning fight. It looks like a fair duel, two planes locked in a knife-edge ballet. But it isn't fair. Once inside that circle, the Zero can point its guns first, slice the turn tighter, and chew up the American's options. For the inexperienced American, trained to match aggression with mirror moves, the trick is invisible until it's too late, and the math of the fight makes that trap deadly. The mathematics of the fight are unforgiving. It isn't just skill or courage, it's geometry and energy. Turn radius, wing loading, and power to weight. The Zero's featherweight frame and huge control surfaces let it tighten its turn at low speed, peeling inside an opponent like a knife. American fighters carried armor, fuel tanks, and heavier engines. That extra mass meant a wider arc every time they tried to follow. In a close, horizontal dogfight, those numbers decide life or death. You don't outfight a Zero in a turn. You lose space, you lose speed, and sooner or later, you lose the sky unless you change the math. American fighters like the P38 Lightning and P40 Warhawk weren't built to dance, they were built to survive. Thick armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and rugged airframes meant these planes could take hits and still bring a pilot home. That durability gave them resilience, but it also made them heavier and slower to turn blunt instruments in skies the Zero could pirouette through. They were built tough. Heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks, engines boxed in and bulked up workhorses, not ballerinas. That weight was the whole point. Take a burst of lead and bring your pilot home. But in a turning fight weight is a prison. The P38 and P40 handled like loaded freight next to a nimble fishhook. They couldn't roll inside a Zero, couldn't hold the tight, furious arcs that decided life or death. Their greatest asset, survivability, became their fatal flaw. A slow, predictable trajectory that invited skilled Japanese pilots to finish the job. It forced a brutal, bloody education in the sky. The result is a brutal learning curve, paid for in full with the lives of young pilots thrown into combat before they've learned how to survive it. Training manuals and peacetime doctrine mean nothing when a Zero can flip inside you on a dime. Tactics printed on paper dissolve under fire. Squadrons learn by dying men, by shattered planes that never come back, by replacements who don't make it through a single tour. Experience, improvisation, and bitter hindsight rewrite the rules in blood. American aviators are trapped in an air war their doctrine didn't prepare them for, facing an enemy who holds the turning advantage. They were trapped skies that should have been free, now felt like a wired cage because the enemy held the one game-changing edge, the ability to turn inside them and bring guns to bear. American pilots learned fast that a classic dogfight was no fair contest. Every attempt to outmaneuver a Zero in the horizontal plane was a slow, deadly surrender. Planes that could take hits and keep flying suddenly became liabilities when finesse, not toughness, decided life or death. It was a brutal, claustrophobic truth that ate at tactics, morale, and training until desperation forced a handful of men to try something no manual dared recommend. Then, out of sheer desperation, something changes. A legend is born not in a classroom or from doctrine, but in the cockpit, in a moment when the sky offers no safe answers. Lieutenant Richard Bong finds himself with a Zero glued to his six at 18,000 feet, cannon muzzles about to bloom. Training says there's only one response and it will kill you. Papers and lectures mean nothing in that frozen heartbeat. Only a raw, terrible choice remains. With adrenaline in his teeth and the ocean yawning far below, Bong does the unthinkable, the move every rulebook warned him away from. With nowhere else to go, Bong ignores every training rule. He snaps the P38 into a brutal, clean roll. Top becomes bottom, sky becomes ground. For a heartbeat, the world flips. The Zero's guns hover above him, wind screams, instruments read upside down, and his stomach drops. It's madness. It's a deliberate gamble. He is now flying completely upside down. Instead of shoving the stick forward into a textbook dive, creating grinding, positive G's, Bong yanks his control back. The world flips. Sky below, earth above, instruments hanging crooked, his stomach in his throat. The P-38's twin engines howl as gravity drags it into a savage, inverted plunge. Speed spikes. The altimeter tumbles. For a suspended, terrifying second, he's upside down and committed, eyes racing, hands steady, pulled into a maneuver every manual hates but that. Right now, feels like the only way out. It wasn't just risky, it was practically outlawed. Pilots were taught again and again that you did not fly inverted and pull. You didn't invite the kind of forces that follow. This wasn't the familiar crush of positive G's. It was the opposite. Blood vaulting into the skull, vision flooding and blanching, a white-hot pressure behind the eyes that could blind you for seconds. Flight manuals stamped warnings. Flight surgeons shook their heads. To roll upside down and dive was to step past every safety margin. Your training had carved out a deliberate gamble with your body, taken only when the alternative was certain death. Official flight medicine didn't sugarcoat it. Negative G's were a medical red line, a violent, soul-rattling shove that tries to eject you from your seat and leaves you clinging to a lap belt for dear life. Manuals, surgeons, and training officers all warned pilots away from deliberate inverted dives. The consensus was blunt and terrifying. The body could not take it. They spoke of blood rushing into the eyes, of blurred vision and, worst case, permanent damage. In short, it wasn't just risky. It was officially intolerable. A maneuver stamped forbidden on paper and feared in every briefing room until the sky proved otherwise. Military flight medicine wasn't being dramatic. Studies from the era recorded real, painful consequences, severe discomfort, tiny hemorrhages in the eyes, and even retinal damage at just -2 Gs. Pilots came back with bloodshot faces and petechiae around their eyes, headaches that clung for hours, and warnings that vision could be impaired at the very instant a split-second decision mattered most. Those dry clinical notes translated into a terrifying cockpit truth. The maneuver that might buy you life could also flood your head with blood and steal your sight for a few heart-stopping seconds. They call it a red out, and the name is literal. -G drags blood up into the skull so violently your vision floods with crimson, veins bursting like tiny fireworks behind the eyes. It starts as a pressure, an animal pounding in the temples, then color swallows the world, then black, instruments blur. Altitude feels meaningless. For pilots who chose this desperate trick, those seconds were a war inside the cockpit. Agony, instinct, and the cold math of timing. You don't see the sky. You feel the plane, count the seconds, and hope the body holds long enough to pull out. For a few critical seconds, the world goes utterly wrong. Vision floods crimson, the sky collapses into a smear, and sound is a distant, thudding pulse as your blood roars in your ears. You are strapped in, hurtling toward the ocean at hundreds of miles an hour, hands on a control that feels both familiar and alien. Instruments become guesses. Time stretches half a heartbeat feels like forever, while every reflex kicks in without your sight. You fly by feel, by muscle memory, by the razor timing drilled into you, counting on a split-second pullout you cannot see coming. Everything narrows to one terrifying choice. The choice is brutal and immediate. Suffer a red out the sick, red wash as blood forces your eyes to flood and vision collapses into a humming, crimson tunnel, or refuse it and watch enemy tracers bite your tail, sure as a hammer. For 2 or 3 terrible seconds you are blind, shoved out of your harness by -Gs, your world reduced to noise and instinct while the ocean rushes up at you. You have to trust timing, training, and a stubborn hope that muscle memory will save you. What would you do when the math says, death but one desperate trick might buy you another sunrise? They choose to live. They choose the red. It wasn't bravado, just a terrible, clear calculation. 2 or 3 seconds of white-hot agony, the world bleeding crimson as blood floods the eyes, or the absolute certainty of being torn apart by enemy guns. So they tensed every muscle, bit down on the stick, and let the lightning fall blind for a breath, trusting training, timing, and instinct to pull out. The cost was real. Burst blood vessels, pounding headaches, days of blurred sight. But the reward was survival. Those who came back carried the lesson like a secret oath. Pain bought another life and another chance to fight. What starts as pure desperation quickly hardens into invention. The inverted dive stops being just a blind, painful escape and becomes a deliberate weapon. Pilots learn to treat that moment of red as a reset and engineered interruption of the fight that buys time, energy, and a new angle. It's brutal and unapologetic. You trade a few heart-stopping seconds of blindness for the chance to turn the whole engagement upside down. Suddenly the problem, your plane's weight, your enemy's turning ability, becomes the solution, because the maneuver lets you trade altitude for velocity and rethink the fight on terms that suit you. Instead of fleeing, pilots learn to turn altitude into ammunition. Roll the Lightning over, pull back, and gravity and thrust stack into breathtaking speed. The P-38 screamed down, engines roaring, while the light, graceful Zero struggled to keep pace. Its delicate wings and fragile systems simply couldn't handle the pull. What looked like escape became the reset. Suddenly, the hunter was the one being chased. In that instant of pure desperation, the Americans did something more than escape. They exposed a fatal secret hidden in the Zero's design. The very lightness that let it dance through turns was the thing that would betray it when the fight went vertical. By rolling over and dumping altitude into a screaming dive, P-38 seconds and jugs turned gravity into a weapon, forcing Zeros to chase into stresses their feather-light wings and delicate systems were never meant to take. What had been an advantage in the horizontal became a liability in the vertical. Agility, it turned out, had been bought with fragility, and that trade would soon be deadly. It looked like a miracle on paper-thin skin and lightning reflexes that let the Zero spin inside any pursuer. But that miracle came with a cost. The very lightness that made it a turn king meant there was nothing left to eat the fury of a high-speed, -G dive. Airloads that a heavier fighter could shrug off became torques and snatches that ripped at ribs and spars, sent control surfaces into dangerous flutter, and peeled rivets like tape. In a heartbeat, graceful agility could become brittle failure. An aircraft designed to dance simply couldn't take the violent strain of being driven straight into the red. Worse still, the Zero had a hidden Achilles heel. Its carbureted engine couldn't drink upside down. Roll inverted and the fuel supply would sputter, then cut sometimes in the middle of a life-or-death escape. 1 second you're hauling to safety. The next, your nose drops and the propeller winds down as if someone pulled the plug. A graceful fighter became a helpless glider, tail sliding toward the ocean while the American on your tail tightened the noose. That mechanical betrayal turned desperate dives into fatal mistakes and set the stage for a very different kind of American advantage. American planes, however, were built differently. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin liquid-cooled Allison engines, could maintain full power even while upside down, something the carbureted Zero would often pay for with sputters and death. Roll the nose over, shove the stick back, and the P-38's engines kept screaming as speed piled on. You didn't bleed power mid-dive. That little mechanical advantage let an American pilot turn altitude into pure, brutal velocity, a way out of a turning match, and the first step toward turning a desperate escape into a deadly counterattack. The P-38 and its kin were built like tanks, not ballerinas. Their heavy, overbuilt airframes soaked up the brutal forces of an inverted -G dive, and then, when the pilot dared it, snapped out of the pull harder and faster than the fragile Zero could manage. Where the Japanese bird would twist, shudder, or even fail under the stress, the American fighters turned that punishment into momentum, trading altitude for terrifying speed and using raw structural strength to flip a desperate escape into a tactical rebound. For a long time, that extra armor and bulky frame felt like a curse. The reason an American fighter couldn't outturn a Zero and why pilots were being slaughtered in horizontal duels. But in the blink between terror and choice, the math flipped. Weight meant momentum, and momentum meant control in the vertical. The same rugged construction that made P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds lumbering targets in a turning fight suddenly let them dive harder, hold power inverted, and pull out at speeds a fragile Zero simply couldn't survive. What had been a fatal flaw became a weapon, the spark of a whole new way to fight. Major Thomas Lynch was one of the first to see it for what it really was. Not luck, not a fluke, but a tool you could use again and again. He'd felt that hair-on-fire moment when everything says run, and he kept returning with proof. Roll inverted, dive, trade altitude for blistering speed, and the zero that wanted your tail suddenly couldn't follow. That moment of desperation hardened into a doctrine in his mind. It stopped being a panic move and became a repeatable, teachable tactic, one that favored American power and discipline over the graceful but fragile enemy. Major Thomas Lynch didn't just stumble into luck, he turned desperation into a weapon. In one furious sequence, he rolled his P38 inverted, dove like a shot, bled off altitude into raw speed, then flipped back into the fight and put 2 zeros on the ocean floor. The math clicked in his head. This maneuver wasn't a last-ditch escape. It was a way to reset the fight, to trade altitude for energy, and strike from a place the zero couldn't follow. That moment changed him. What had been forbidden became doctrine in his hands, and he left the flight line already planning how to teach every man under him. Lynch didn't treat it like a lucky fluke, he made it a lesson. After his 2-0 day, he pulled his pilots together and walked them through the inverted dive. The when, the how, the timing, the brutal trade-offs. He taught them to convert altitude into raw speed, to use the P-38's engines and rugged frame as weapons, and to resist the instinct to turn. He hammered home safety limits never below a safe altitude, brace for the redout, and drilled the timing to pull out and climb back into the fight. What began as desperation became doctrine because it played to American strengths: power and speed in the vertical, not graceful turning in the horizontal. It wasn't written in any manual. Nobody in a suit signed off on it. The trick was born in the air and taught on the ground, passed mouth to ear like contraband. Pilots who'd felt a zero on their tail would pull aside the new guys between missions and show them with fingers on a clipboard, a quick sketch in the dirt, a whispered countdown how to roll, when to pull, the ugly math of altitude and speed that kept you alive. Commanders frowned. Flight surgeons warned, but men who'd watched friends die didn't care about doctrine. They passed the secret on, quietly, urgently, until the warrior network became the only training that mattered. On the flight line, the lessons skipped manuals and came from men who'd just lived it. Veterans, still raw from a rescue by dive, pulled green pilots aside, low voices, a quick sketch on a greasy map, and passed on the forbidden move. Short, brutal, and true. Flip over, dive, and live to fight another day. It was unofficial, unsanctioned. Commanders called it dangerous, an outright liability if something went wrong, and they told their pilots to never try it, to stick to the book and live to fight another day. But orders on paper and worries in headquarters couldn't erase what worked in combat. So the maneuver lived in the shadows. Whispered briefings on the flight line, furtive demonstrations between sorties, a dangerous trick passed mouth to ear from veteran to rookie. The brass frowned. The paperwork frowned. The pilots kept doing it anyway, because in that moment of panic, doctrine mattered less than staying alive. Still, the whispers in the briefing rooms didn't die because it worked. Young pilots who'd walked away from a fight would pull a greenhorn aside between pre-flight checks, sketch a quick diagram on a greasy napkin, or mime the roll with restless hands. They didn't argue with doctrine, they passed on survival. Commanders scowled, flight surgeons tutted, but the simple, grim calculus won out. If a forbidden move put you back on the strip instead of a slab, you learned it. The rumor spread not as gossip, but as a lifeline, quiet, urgent, and patient. And before long, it wasn't just a trick, it was the tactic that kept men alive. By June of 1000, 943, the inverted dive had stopped being a whispered prank and become the unofficial secret weapon of P-38 pilots across the Southwest Pacific. It spread like gossip on the flight line, tacit, urgent, passed mouth to ear between veteran and greenhorn, because it worked when doctrine failed. Squadrons learned to expect the roll and the scream of a lightning diving back into the fight. Survival rates climbed, confidence hardened, and whole tactics were quietly rewritten in foxholes and mess halls rather than staff rooms. It was dangerous, unsanctioned, and gloriously effective, a small, brutal innovation that began to tilt the sky in America's favor. Major Charles MacDonald, remember, that name wasn't some theoretical tactician. He was a scarred, surviving ace who said plainly the inverted dive had saved his life more than once. He came back from missions with a face like thunder and a grin that said he'd cheated death, and he didn't keep the secret. Between pre-flight checks, he pulled younger pilots aside, showed them the timing, corrected their instincts, and hammered the lesson into practice with the bluntness of a man who'd stared over the edge. What began as panic hardened into habit. The desperate trick became a practiced move that would reshape how they fought. It became brutally simple. Meet the enemy with high-speed diving passes. If a zero hooks your 6, don't try to turn. Roll your lightning inverted and dive away. Convert altitude into raw speed. Reset the fight. Rebuild position. The move wasn't elegant. It was a cold, mechanical solution, fast, lethal, and taught from pilot to pilot until it worked every time. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the swirling, poetic dogfighting the books love to tell. It was ugly, abrupt, and born out of sheer panic, a half-second decision to flip, dive, and trade, a turning fight for raw energy and speed. But it worked. It let heavier American fighters turn their supposed weakness into a weapon, reset hopeless chases, and walk away with the initiative. Pilots who learned to pull that desperate move lived to fight another day, and squads that taught it cut their losses. Still, the victory was hard-earned, and the next chapter would show exactly what it cost those men. But survival came at a terrifying physiological price. The readout wasn't a brief sting. It was pure agony, blood hammering in the skull, vision flooding with crimson, the world collapsing into a brief, blinding tunnel. For 2 to 3 seconds, pilots flew without sight, held only by instinct, timing, and the hope their hands remembered what their eyes could not. They learned to grit their teeth, lock every muscle, and count those seconds like a countdown to safety, because it was. The maneuver bought lives, yes, but it left bodies and nerves rattled. A hidden toll flight surgeons would soon begin to catalog. Flight surgeons saw the cost in living color. Pilots coming back from missions with petechial hemorrhages, tiny burst blood vessels sprinkled across their sclera, eyes rimmed in red and bruising, faces that startled ground crews and made veterans look like monsters. It wasn't just a gruesome badge. It was proof of real physiological trauma, the aftermath of being slammed blood first into the skull. And those same men complained of pounding headaches, fuzzy balance, and vision problems that lingered long after they climbed out of the cockpit. It didn't end when they touched down. Pilots came back from a single desperate maneuver looking worse than any battle scar, splintered nerves, pounding headaches that stole sleep, a permanent fog of disorientation that made the world feel wrong, and vision that wavered for hours or days afterward. Flight surgeons logged swollen, burst blood vessels, and doctors warned of lingering problems. Some men needed weeks to shake the after effects. Others never quite did. They'd survive the guns, only to be haunted by headaches and blurry horizons. And yet those terrifying blind seconds in the dive, the instant they were flying without sight, were the cost they'd already decided to pay. For those 2 or 3 seconds, they were completely blind. the world collapsed into a pressure so fierce blood rushed into the head and vision flooded with a violent, living red. Ears popped, faces felt like they'd been tightened in a vise, and the sky vanished. Pilots flew by, feel muscle memory, raw instinct, and almost animal timing, waiting for the exact moment to yank the stick and pull out before earth or ocean met them. It was terrifying, mechanical, and precise. A handful of beats where training had to replace sight, where courage meant trusting your hands more than your eyes, and where every successful pull-out bought another sunrise. So an unwritten rule spread through the warrior network. Never, ever attempt the inverted dive below 8,000 feet. There was simply no margin for error. That altitude bought you the few precious seconds to survive a 2 or 3 second red out. Any lower, and you weren't dodging guns so much as gambling with the ocean. Above the safety line, never below 8,000 feet, they turned agony into routine. At the first gut-wrenching pull, they clenched every muscle, arms locked, feet braced, jaw tight, gripping the stick like a lifeline. They pinched their eyes, held their breath, and counted the seconds as if timing a heartbeat. Those tiny vows of control shaved fractions off the readout. 2 molten seconds felt like an eternity, but training and sheer will shortened it enough to keep them alive. It wasn't glamour, just a carved ritual of survival, the only way to trade blinding pain for another sunrise. They learned to silence a body that screamed for mercy, to lock every jaw and clench every limb until the world went red and their eyes betrayed them. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, they lost sight, blood pooling, vision flooding with crimson but not control. Muscle memory took over, instinct and timing became their instruments. They counted heartbeats instead of watching the horizon, felt the surge, stored the rhythm of the pullout in their hands. It was agony, brief, blinding, humiliating, but it bought them another dawn. Pain became the price of survival, paid in seconds so they could live to fly again. By late 1943, the whispered trick had finally graduated from rumor to rule. The pilots who had learned to fly through the red were no longer just desperate mavericks. They were proof. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, watched mission reports and bloodshot pilots and decided to stop pretending it was merely a rogue improvisation. He folded the inverted dive into unit doctrine. He ordered training flights, written procedures, and briefings so that the maneuver could be taught, practiced, and used reliably instead of lived as a gamble. Suddenly, the outlaw escape became an institutional tool, tailored to American strengths and deadly by design. Kirby flew the P47 Thunderbolt, an absolute behemoth pilots called the Jug. It dove like a freight train, and it turned about as well as a brick. On paper, that looked like a flaw. In practice, it was a weapon, a rugged, powerful airframe that soaked up negative G dives and let pilots trade maneuver for sheer, vertical speed perfect for the new high-speed tactics. Colonel Neil Kirby put theory to the test, and the test roared. Flying the P47 Jug, he dove like a freight train, rolled inverted, slammed the throttles, and then ripped back up into the fight. In a string of savage engagements, he shot down 6 Japanese planes, each kill a blunt answer to the old rulebook. That tally turned a desperate, forbidden escape into hard proof. This brutal, vertical doctrine worked, and now it demanded the attention of commanders. Soon the trick spread like a rumor down the line. Other units copied it. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons and even Navy carrier groups began slipping the inverted dive into their briefings, taught quietly between missions and chalked onto squadron boards. What had started as a forbidden, desperate move became a standard tool, fast, ugly, and devastatingly effective. The powerful F-4U Corsair, built like a fighter-bomber tank, soaked up forces that would shatter a Zero. Its stout wings and beefy structure made inverted, high-speed dives not suicide, but strategy. Pilots learned they could gut their energy into a terrifying plunge and trust the Corsair to hold together while lighter foes fell apart. Short flights turned into long lessons. Squadrons drilled the move. Carriers and island airstrips echoed with the same brutal command: roll inverted, dump altitude, reset the fight. By mid-1944, that desperate whispered trick had stopped being a secret. It was a standard tool in the American arsenal. For a long while, the Japanese simply couldn't make sense of it. Their fighters had been built and flown to win the turning fight. Teach pilots to nose inside, to bleed an opponent in circles, to trade altitude for instantaneous turning advantage. The Zero was the perfect expression of that doctrine. So when American planes rolled over and plunged straight down instead of trading turns, it violated everything those pilots believed. It looked wrong, reckless, even cowardly. In the cockpit, veteran instincts screamed that a retreat was underway, not a new tactic. They had no frame of reference for what they were watching. From their cockpit, it looked like chaos. The Americans rolled over and plunged earthward, and to the Japanese it read one way: panic. They took those sudden, inverted dives as the desperate flailing of undisciplined pilots, not the cold, hard tactic they actually were. In a culture and doctrine that worshipped the close turning fight, breaking off felt dishonorable, so they misread intent as weakness. That misreading cost them the initiative. What looked like cowardice was actually a reset button, a baited trap. And because they couldn't see past their assumptions, they were about to pay the price. Convinced they had the kill, Japanese pilots closed in eyes hard, fingers on the triggers. They misread the roll and dive as panic, not a tactic. So they followed, nose down and throttles open, dragging their fragile Zeros into the very same brutal, high-speed descent. Their American prey had just survived chasing a ghost into danger they didn't understand. The result was catastrophic for the Japanese. Zeros built to dance couldn't take the brutal physics of a high-speed plunge. Wings peeled away like paper as brutal airloads slammed through flimsy spars, and fuselages folded under forces they were never designed to bear. Control surfaces shredded. Pilots watched in horror as chunks of airplane tumbled away into the blue. There was no graceful crash, only sudden structural failure and men falling fast. And even on planes that held together, engines would often cough and die, leaving helpless gliders spiraling below the fight. Sometimes, even when a Zero skin held together, the pilot wasn't safe. The carbureted engine would cough, sputter, then die when inverted, leaving the plane a powerless glider. Prop windmilling, speed bleeding off, the pilot watched altitude vanish. Suddenly below the fight, helpless and drifting, unable to follow or recover before the American Lightning or Jug came roaring back. From a distance, it looked like panic American fighters rolling away, diving hard, seemingly conceding the fight. What the Japanese didn't see was the why. The inverted dive wasn't a retreat, it was a reload. Pilots weren't running from battle. They were buying time and energy, trading altitude for speed to reset the engagement on their terms. For a few brutal seconds, they endured blinding redouts and pounding heads so they could come back at a disadvantage turned into an advantage. What looked like cowardice on the radio was, more often than not, the calm of a man planning his next strike. They weren't running, they were resetting the fight. By rolling inverted and dumping altitude, they turned height into raw, savage speed energy the heavy American fighters could generate and hold, while the fragile Zeros couldn't. The dive let them bleed off a pursuer's advantage, pull out below or alongside, then use that built-up velocity to rip back up and strike from above. where speed and mass beat agility. It was a simple physics trick wrapped in desperation: trade vertical for velocity, buy time, and then climb back into a firing position the Japanese hadn't expected. Suddenly, the chase became a trap. The hunter had become the hunted. What had been a reliable Japanese strategy, bait a fight into the turn, unraveled the moment American pilots learned to go vertical. Zeros, designed to dance in horizontal combat, were dragged into dives they couldn't survive. Engines stumbled, wings tore away, pilots tumbled out of the sky. By the time Tokyo realized the tactical mistake and tried to adapt, its hardest-won cadre of veterans was already gone, replaced by rushed trainees who never learned the new rules. Meanwhile, American squadrons arrived in theater fluent in the vertical game, and the balance in the Pacific had quietly, finally, tipped. The knowledge gap had completely reversed. By late 1944, new American pilots weren't green kids learning on the fly. They arrived in the Pacific already taught the veteran-tested vertical tactics before their first combat mission. What had been a whispered life-saving trick on flight lines was now drilled into training. Roll inverted, convert altitude to speed, reset the fight. Squadrons practiced it on gunnery ranges and in simulators. Stories of redouts and ripped zeros became lessons, not legends. That preparedness changed everything. Suddenly, air battles were fought on American terms, and the edge once held by the Zero was slipping away. Meanwhile, Japan's veteran pilot corps had been almost wiped out. Experienced leaders, instructors, and the men who knew how to survive a dogfight were gone. What replaced them was a churn of green recruits shoved through a hollowed-out training pipeline. Fewer flight hours, fewer instructors, stripped syllabi, and rushed graduations instead of seasoning. These kids reached the front with checklists in their heads, but no hard-earned instincts, no time to practice emergency tricks or learn to read a fight. The result was brutal and predictable. Inexperienced pilots thrown into a new, vertical kind of air combat, and a yawning gap American tactics were already exploiting. Worse yet, the new Japanese pilots were being churned out of a broken system and fed an old creed honor, tight turns, the horizontal duel that had defined their doctrine when the air war had already mutated into something else. They burned with confidence and tradition, drilled to outturn an enemy, not to survive a screaming vertical world where speed and energy mattered more than finesse. That mismatch wasn't theoretical, it was deadly. Unprepared, inexperienced, and taught the wrong fight, they kept flying into tactics they didn't understand and into the teeth of a sky that was fast becoming American. By late 1944, the skies over the Pacific belonged to the Americans. What had started as a handful of desperate hacks, inverted dives, brutal negative G gambits, and a culture of quiet teaching among veterans had become standard practice. New pilots arrived trained to trade turns for power, altitude for speed, and survivability for a few seconds of blinding pain. Meanwhile, Japan's veteran cadre was gone, their trainees still learning the old, honorable dogfight. The balance tipped so completely that air superiority was no longer about aircraft alone. It was about who had learned to break the rules and live. The legacy of this desperate innovation is staggering. What started as a last-ditch gut decision became doctrine. Negative G dives stopped being forbidden tricks and turned into a fundamental way to manage energy in a fight, escape without surrender, convert altitude into speed, reset the engagement, and choose when to climb back in. That shift rewired training, tactics, and the instincts of generations of American pilots, teaching them to fight vertically instead of just flatly. It changed aircraft employment, squadron mindset, and even procurement priorities. Above all, It proved that survival-born improvisation can become institutional strength, a hard-earned lesson passed from bruised veterans to every new pilot who climbed into a cockpit. That lesson didn't die with World War II, it evolved. In Korea, pilots locked in with the nimble MiG-15 rediscovered the same idea. Don't trade slow turns. Trade altitude for speed. Use vertical energy to reset the fight and force the enemy into stresses their airframes and engines couldn't handle. The hard, costly lessons of Vietnam then forced a hard look at training, and the Navy's Top Gun school brought those veteran tricks back into the classroom, formally taught, refined, and drilled until they became muscle memory. A tactic born of desperation became doctrine, passed down from one desperate generation to the next. This revolution happened entirely outside the system. No engineer designed it. No general approved it. It was forged in the crucible of combat and carried forward as a secret whispered on flight lines. It lived in the briefings between missions, in hushed handfuls of advice traded by pilots who had seen a wing tear away or watched a friend never come back. An illicit technique born of fear and stubbornness, taught in hangars and over coffee, passed from scarred veterans to green replacements. Dangerous, unofficial, and utterly practical, it spread because it worked, saving planes, saving lives, and quietly rewrote how Americans fought in the sky. Their legacy isn't stamped on a medal, it's a motion, a lesson, a breath held at the top of a climb. It lives every time an instructor tells a young pilot to roll the jet inverted to escape a tail, every time a trainee learns to trade altitude for speed and buy a second chance. That's a direct line back to a handful of desperate men who, with guns on their tails and no good options, chose to defy the rulebook and fly into the red. Remember them not for glory, but for grit, the brutal, unwritten chapter they wrote in the sky. Remember their sacrifice